Hello YouTube, Dave here again. A while back I did a series of videos that was aimed towards newer players and dungeon masters, and the idea was to give some general advice for beginners on how to do certain things like designing your first encounter, your first adventure, things along those lines. But kind of looking back at them now, and after receiving a request from somebody to go into a bit more detail, I realized that a lot of the stuff that I talked about, I was talking about from having the experience of running Dungeons & Dragons games for nearly 20 years. So things like just, trying to make balanced encounters, it seems a lot easier to me now than it was when I first started. I had mentioned the Dungeon Master's Guide had some information on designing encounters, but I didn't actually discuss it, and that's what I kind of want to do here today. So I'm going to revisit this series, and I'm actually going to not only just go over how to kind of put some encounters together using some examples, I'm also going to go over some things like just some basic dungeon design, as well as some basic adventure stuff. And I'm going to use the examples that I create here today as ongoing stuff to use for advice on encounter development, how to make things interesting encounters, how to use your encounter groups that you come up with to create an adventure with. And this is, again, mostly going to be geared towards newer dungeon masters. But I think it's something that will be helpful, and I have had some inexperienced individuals or people who are new to the game ask for a little bit more specific advice. So the first thing I want to do, I'm not going to leave this open to this page throughout the entirety of the video. So if you're watching this and you're a dungeon master and you're new and you want to learn how to do some of this stuff, what I'd recommend is turning to page 82 in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So the information on encounters, creating encounters, does start on page 81. That's just kind of going over some things like what the objectives are and things of that nature, but we want to actually get into the mechanics of creating encounters using the information outlined in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So what we're going to do here is, again, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I want you guys to sort of follow along with what's going on here. So what I'm going to do is basically lay out the encounters or create some sample encounters doing the first 4 steps, 5 steps actually, and just kind of going through and doing all that. Now, I'm going to be using examples, so the level for your characters or the things, monsters that you want to use are going to vary, so just kind of keep that in mind. But the first thing that we have to do is determine the party's XP thresholds. So you use that based off of this chart here, and you look at basically what your player's character's levels are, and you add the numbers together. The example that they give in the book is for 3 third-level characters and 1 second-level character, but I'm going to do just a party of 4 third-level characters. So just kind of looking at the chart here, and I've got a thing typed up that'll make it a little bit easier, so I'm not going to focus on this right now, but you just basically use this chart and you just kind of go across for the numbers if you want to create an easy encounter, a medium encounter, a hard encounter, or a deadly encounter. So you would add all these numbers together for the number of player characters that are in the party. So whatever their level is, you can kind of use that as a general guide depending on what type of the 4 difficulties of encounters you want to do. And I'll make this make a little bit more sense when we look at the numbers here. Alright, the next thing to do is determine the party's threshold, which is what I had just mentioned, is adding everything together. So we're just going to close this back up for a second. And I'm just going to show you what I typed up because it may show up a little bit better here. So, again, page 82, the example encounters are designed for a party of 4 third-level characters. So for easy encounters, the individual player's XP threshold is 75 experience points. For medium, it's 150, hard is 225, and deadly is 400. So a simple rule of thumb is if you're looking to create an easy encounter for these third-level characters, each monster could have like 75 experience points, and it'd be considered something that would be easy for the party. And again, I'll get into some more specific examples here later on. Then we get our threshold for the party. So basically, I've got 4 third-level characters. So 75 times 4 is 300 experience points. So if an encounter has a total amount of experience points based off the monsters, and I'll show you the monster stat blocks and how you get the experience amounts here in a moment. But if it's 300, between 300 and 600, it is an easy encounter. If it's between 600 and 900, it is a medium encounter. Once you get to 900 and just below 1600 is considered a hard encounter, and anything above 1600 is considered a deadly encounter. So those are the thresholds that I've got to work with. Now what I want to do is try to create one encounter group for each of those difficulty classes. So I want to have an encounter type that I can just have everything put together for that's going to be easy. I want one that's going to be medium difficulty, which will be the most common one encountered when I move on later on in the series to actually creating sort of like an adventure using these encounter groups. I want to make one that's hard, and I want to make one that's deadly. Now the idea is that the hard encounter and deadly encounter are going to have the least amount of frequency, and likely only one of each, whereas the medium difficulty is going to be the most common type of encounter, and the easy difficulties, there's going to be a few of them, but not too many, just sort of to balance out the fact that there are hard and deadly encounters in the adventure when I go to design it. Now, up next, I want to do stuff with orcs. Orcs are some of my favorite monsters, and a lot of my campaigns will have them as sort of the antagonist. So, I want to go into the Monster Manual, because I want to create an adventure that is going to be using stat blocks straight from the Monster Manual, something that's quick and easy, something that you can throw together and make it something that it's easy for beginner DMs to just take the stat blocks out of here without modifying things like adding class levels or other types of abilities. So we're going to go straight into our Monster Manual. We're going to look for orcs, as long as we don't overshoot like we did. Alright, oozes. Whoops. They would be after oozes. So, we've got our orcs here. So what I'm looking at are just a few different types of orcs. So, you got our standard orc, our orc war chief, and our orc Eye of Grumish. There's also the Orog, but they're sort of like a half orc, half ogre. And I don't really want to use, I'm not going to be using them, so I'm just going to be focusing on these three things. But I want to have a little bit more than just the orcs in the adventures. So, a type of animal that they may have as guardians of their camp or whatever, I want to incorporate something. So I decided that I'm also going to use some wolves. So, just going back to the back of the Monster Manual where our animals are. So we just got our basic wolf here. So for the first encounter, I want something that's kind of easy. So I want it to be just a small group of enemies, and I figured that having a wolf, which is the lowest, least tough or difficult monster in the groupings that I'm going to do, I want that to be in the easy encounter. So, looking at my XP numbers, just as a general rule, I'm looking to make an easy encounter here, and I know you can probably already see what I've got set up, but so I want to have less than or close to 300 experience points for an easy encounter. So I decided that I was going to make what's called a small patrol, or what I'm calling a small patrol, which is going to consist of one wolf, which when you look at a challenge here, that gives you the experience points that it's worth when you go for sort of like, you can kind of consider those thresholds to be almost like a budget if you want. Just something numbers to kind of shoot for depending on what type of encounters you want to make. Now it's not going to be quite as simple as that, and I'll explain why in a moment, but we've got 50 experience for the wolf, and I'm just going to choose 2 basic orcs to go along with it. So these orcs are 100 experience points each. So I've got 2 orcs and 1 wolf, and there's different things that I can do with those groupings of monsters, which I'll talk about in part 2 of this series, where I look at ways of making combats more interesting. Because right now we're just looking at base encounter groups that we can use as sort of a go-to when designing our adventure. So we've got that set up. Now the next thing that I want to do is make a more standard encounter, an easier encounter, so to speak. but, well, not easier than the one we had before, but one that's going to be difficult enough when the player characters face them that it's going to be somewhat challenging, but not to the point where it should cause character fatalities. So I just want a standard encounter that I'm going to go to, and that standard encounter is going to be really simple. It's going to consist of 4 orcs. So 4 orcs at 100 experience points apiece. Now again, that sounds like it's a low amount, or still sounds like it's in that easy category range, but we'll explain why it's not in a bit. But again, so this is sort of your standard. A group of 4 orcs is going to be sort of the default encounter for most of the combat situations that I'm going to have. The next thing that I want to do is have sort of what I would call an elite encounter, or sort of, if you're familiar with video game terms, sort of like a mini boss encounter. So this is something that's going to be a bit more difficult, and it's going to have a more challenging creature in there than just the standard orcs. There are going to still be 2 standard orcs in this encounter, so I'm still going to have 2 of these guys, but I'm also going to incorporate an Eye of Grumish. So we've got 2 orcs, so that's 200 experience points there. Then we've got an orc Eye of Grumish, which is worth 450 experience points. So that's 650 experience points now for this encounter. And this guy has some spells that he can cast. And if you want, you can always change what the spells are, and that's something that you can do for customization. For example, if you don't want to have Bless and Command, you could have the Eye of Grumish have Cure Wounds or Inflict Wounds, something along those lines if you want to switch it up, and that's totally fine. But again, it makes for a more challenging encounter, and it sort of sets up, like I said, kind of a mini-boss type of thing. So when you get close to near the end of the dungeon, but not quite finished it, you have this encounter, and it's something that's going to be a little bit more difficult. So we've got that, and the last thing that we want is basically our final encounter, the most challenging encounter, or the final boss, if you will. So for the final boss, what I want to have is something that is potentially deadly if the characters don't use proper tactics and don't, attack things carefully and, instead of just charging in recklessly. So I've got the Orc War Chief that I want to use for sure. He's a challenge rating of 4, which is actually slightly above the rest of the party. So they're 3rd level characters. So this guy is going to be difficult. He's worth 1,100 experience points on his own. But I don't want him to be completely on his own, because that way it means essentially that the characters are going to have just, free range on them. And 4 characters on one villain or one character or creature is not going to have them last very long. So I'm going to give him sort of an orc consort to go with him. So basically his wife or his mistress or whatever, there's going to be a female orc in there as well that will fight alongside of him. So that just adds a second body to the encounter that the characters will have to deal with. So that is 1,100 plus 100, so that's 1,200 experience points. So just looking at our base numbers here. So we've got our encounter set up, our encounter groups. So we've got 2 what you could consider easy encounters just on their own, looking at the base numbers. So the small patrol, we have 2 orcs worth 100 experience points each, and 1 wolf that's worth 50 experience, for a total of 250 experience points. And there is a lot of just kind of tedious math involved with this. Once you get more comfortable and have more experience designing encounters, you can do a lot of this without having to worry about these numbers. But again, I just want to show you how you can kind of design them using these threshold numbers that are in the Dungeon Master's Guide on page 82. We've got our standard patrol, which has 4 orcs worth 100 experience points each, so it has a base amount of experience points of 400. We then have our lead encounter, which is 2 orcs worth 100 experience points each, Eye of Grumish for 450, so that's 650 experience points. And then our final encounter is just 1 orc worth 100 experience points, and the Orc War Chief worth 1,100 experience points, for 1,200 experience points total. Now these numbers, the 250, the 400, the 650, and the 1,200, these are the actual experience values that the encounters are worth. So when the party overcomes a small patrol of, the 2 orcs and a wolf, they're going to gain 250 experience points. When they overcome an encounter group of 4 orcs, they're going to gain 400, and so on. However, we haven't determined properly yet if these encounters are going to be easy, medium, hard, or deadly difficulties. So the way we do that is we go back to page 82, and we've got encounter multipliers. So the premise behind this is that the more creatures that you have in a combat situation, the more potentially deadly it is for the player characters, because it constitutes things like more attack rolls made against them, so greater chances for critical damage, longer combats because the characters have to defeat more monsters, things along these lines. So what you have to do is find how many number of monsters you have in your encounter and then multiply their base experience totals by the multiplier that's here. So single monsters is just times 1, 2 monsters is times 1.5, 3 to 6 monsters is times 2, which would be your most common one. Number of monsters 7 to 10 is 2.5, 11 to 14 is times 3, and 15 or more monsters would be times 4 for the experience modifiers. Now, the thing that I really wanted to discuss with this is the multipliers for the number of creatures is only used to determine if it's an easy, medium, hard, or deadly encounter. You do not award the modified experience points regardless of how many monsters are in there. It's just a mechanism to let you know how many of these encounters you really should be using. The overall idea being that medium is going to be the most commonly encountered types, or the most commonly used types of encounters, I should say. Easy will probably be the second most commonly used, with hard, probably tied with hard difficulty, so you usually try to offset those a little bit. And then you also have a deadly encounter, which is something that should show up very, very rarely, so it's not something that should be used every single time. But because I wanted to create an encounter for each of these types, I then had to go through and apply the multipliers to our base XP totals just to determine if an encounter is going to be easy difficulty, medium difficulty, hard difficulty, or deadly difficulty. So, looking at our small patrol, we have 2 orcs and 1 wolf, so the base experience points is 250. There are 3, so the encounter multiplier is there are 3 monsters. So looking back at our chart, again, if you want to have the book open, the DMG open to page 82 as you go through this, then you certainly can. So that's times 2. So the modified XPs is 500. So this makes this an easy encounter because it's still below the 600 experience point threshold for medium encounters. So anything, really, I mean anything, zero would be no encounters, but anything up to like 599, although they don't do it like that, so I'd say up to 550 experience points for third level characters. 4 third level characters would still be technically classified as an easy encounter. Moving on to our standard patrol, we have 4 orcs with a base experience point total of 400. The encounter multiplier is 4 monsters, so that's still within the 3 to 6 range, so it's times 2. The modified experience points is 800, so that would put it less than the threshold for hard encounters, but above the threshold for medium encounters. So this would be considered a medium encounter difficulty. Our elite encounter is 2 orcs with 1 Eye of Grimish, so the base experience points is 650, as we've got up here. The encounter multiplier is once again 3 because we have 3 creatures, which is at times 2. As I said, your 3 to 6 multiplier is going to be the most commonly used one that you're going to end up going to when designing encounters, because most times you're going to be having between 3 to 6 monsters. You know, there are times where you may go over and there are times where you may go under, but the 3 to 6 is the most common. So that gives us a modified experience total of 1300, which makes it a hard encounter because it is over 900 for the modified experience points, but it is less than 1600. And then finally, we have our final encounter, which is an Orc War Chief and an Orc. Our base experience points is 1200. Our encounter multiplier is 2 monsters, so we multiply the experience points by 1.5, which gives a modified experience point total of 1800, which makes it a deadly encounter. And as I said before, modified XPs are only used to determine encounter difficulty. When awarding XPs or experience points, you do so based on the each monster's individual experience point total. So, we now have some easy encounters, some standard or medium difficulty encounters. We have one hard encounter, and we have one deadly encounter. So that's how sort of how we use the book. So we've got our thresholds for each individual character. For the party as a whole, we have the experience point values for our encounter groups that are going to be actually awarded for defeating each of these encounters. And then we have our modified experience to just determine what the difficulty is going to be for each of the encounters. Now, there are ways that you can also combine some of these encounters in order to create a more challenging encounter from them. So this is the one thing that I'm just going to say in this video, because this is still all dealing with the experience points and determining difficulties and things like that. So again, if you want to get a little bit more, you don't want to just always be using, like, the party encounters, a standard patrol of orcs or a small patrol. You want to mix things up maybe a little bit. So what we have here is the party could come across 2 standard patrols of monsters. So that would be 8 orcs total, because each standard patrol consists of 4 orcs. That gives us a base experience point value of 800. The encounter multiplier is for 8 monsters, so that's times 2.5. So the 800 times 2.5 experience gives us 2,000, which makes a party of 4 third-level characters going up against 8 orcs potentially deadly, because it puts their experience point, or the modified experience points, is over the 1600. So it's one of the things that you can do. And for example, if the player characters decide to charge in on the orc camp without, trying to come up with tactics or finding ways to separate the, some orcs from the rest, then, that should be considered a deadly encounter. We also have 2 small patrols that we could do as well, which is 4 orcs and 2 wolves. Gives us a base experience points of 500. There are 6 monsters, so again that is only times 2, which is our standard one. So the modified experience points for this encounter would be 1,000, which makes it a hard encounter, fighting against 4 orcs and 2 wolves, but doesn't necessarily make it a deadly encounter. So that's sort of how they want you to use the book. And now again, this is just an example using 4 third-level characters. So obviously, if you have higher-level characters or lower-level characters, the numbers are going to be different. The monsters that you're going to use are going to be different. But just basically consult this chart, find however many number of player characters that you have and what their individual levels should be. Ideally, if you're running a game, all the characters should be the same level. Now, I'm running Adventurers League, where if somebody dies and they don't get their character raised, then they come back with a first-level character. So that's where something like this would come in a little bit more into use for me personally. But you just go across, find what you want for, like, what your level is. Each individual character, you find their amounts, add them together for the number of characters in the party. And you just go into your monster manual, find the experience or the challenge header for the monsters, get their experience totals, add those together, which you can use sort of like I said, sort of like an XP budget, so that you know how many experience points you're going to be awarding the characters. Now, the book does mention a little bit later on, there's an adventuring day XP I don't want to say limits, but expectations maybe. Now these are adjusted, so it looks like it means based off of, multiplying it by the number of creatures, so not the actual number of experience points awarded. It assumes that each character will face encounters that gives an adjusted XP amounts of, like for third level characters, of 1,200 for each day that they encounter, or that they have combats in before they have to rest. I wouldn't worry so much about this. It's the player character's option to rest when they want, essentially. The main thing to focus on is what's on page 82, so that you can sort of create your encounters and know how difficult they're going to be. And we're going to use these difficulties later on in part 3 of the series, when we're actually going to start putting things together and designing an actual sort of a small short adventure. But for right now, we have some encounter groups that we can just sort of refer to, and we know which ones are going to be the easy encounters, which ones are going to be the medium, which one's going to be the hard encounter, and of course we have our deadly encounter as well. And we have just a couple of examples of just mixing things up a little bit, or adding multiple groups together. In this case, they both ended up doubling groups just because I wanted to sort of get to the 2.5, but I didn't want to have like all deadly encounters type of thing. So I still wanted to make something that was a hard encounter, and the easiest way to do it was just to multiply these groups by 2. Anyway, so that was the first step of designing encounters using the information and the steps outlined in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So again, this is a useful tool for beginner Dungeon Masters. Once you get, again, more experienced and more comfortable with, running encounters and kind of having an idea what the player characters can handle and what they can't handle, then you'll be able to do this without having to look at these charts. You'll just sort of have a feel for it type of thing. But starting off, this is sort of a useful set of tools. So again, page 82 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. I do recommend reading over the entire section on encounter design. But today we wanted to focus on just the mechanics of designing encounters. So I hope that this made things a little bit easier. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments. I will answer as many of them as I can to try to make this as simple as possible for everybody. Because I honestly found personally that I didn't really need the idea of modifying the experience points based on the number of creatures, because you're only using that to determine the difficulty of the encounter. It doesn't do anything for the actual experience points that the player characters earn. So I found like that step to be sort of unnecessary, but again, I've been putting encounters together for nearly 20 years now. So not that I'm the world's leading expert on encounter design, but I've been doing it for so long that a lot of it's second nature. However, if you're starting off, I recommend adhering to all the different steps. So I hope you found this video helpful. Be sure to check out part 2. So this was just basically designing adventure or encounters. This was the basics. This is sort of the meat and potatoes of just putting some creatures together and determining what kind of difficulty it's going to be for the group. In part 2, what I want to discuss are some ways and techniques or things that you can do to make your encounters a bit more dynamic or interesting. So instead of always having it just be that you encounter a group of, like, say, a standard patrol of 4 orcs, roll initiative, do the battle, battle's over, go to the next area, find another standard encounter, roll for initiative. So to try to keep things from getting that routine or tedious, I've got a few ideas for making encounters, again, a bit more interesting, a bit more dynamic, ways to incorporate environment and other effects or other things that you can do to make it so it's a little bit more interesting. So be sure to come back for part 2. That should be up next week. And then part 3, we're going to look at designing we're basically going to look at designing a dungeon and using these encounters, these encounter groups here, to flesh it out and fill it out. So anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. Again, I hope you found this helpful and useful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and be sure to come back for part 2. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.